So this is GitHub Enterprise Security Best Practices, or GitHub Best Practices. We're going to have more of a slant toward GitHub Enterprise, as there's much more you can do with GitHub Enterprise than configuring on .com. But there'll be a lot of things that apply to .com as well, just so you know. Kind of at the heart of this conversation is making sure that you lock down your GitHub as all of your intellectual property and everything are a fundamental part of that, but also making sure that you can still collaborate, and do everything else you'd like to do, knowing that it's GitHub's, the platform that you're using. That's one of the main advantages of GitHub. So let's get started. I'm Matt Duff. I'm an implementation specialist at GitHub. I live in Utah, work remotely, and travel all around the country and the world to bring GitHub Enterprise and GitHub to different corporations and customers that want to get up and running with GitHub. And so I'm part of the services organization at GitHub. Services@github.com is where you can reach us. And if you have any questions like how do I get up and running, if we move to GitHub Enterprise, or we need training to get the developers up and running on Git, if you're moving from some other version control system, we can definitely help. And we answer all inquiries in there and get you in the pipeline and get you talking to people who can help craft the right solution for whatever your specific need is. And the main offerings that we have are training and implementations. And so we are over on the other side of the building, over by the Grab a Bite, and please don't be a stranger. It'll be nice to talk with you, and you can stop by. I know the conference is almost coming to a close, but don't hesitate to just walk over and ask us a question, and even set up a meeting for another time during the upcoming weeks. That's not a problem. So how does this apply to security for specifically our services team is we visit companies of varying sizes, and different needs. So we visit, small startups that have a few people all the way to corporations that have thousands of users on the platform. And obviously the needs for these different kind of corporations can vary greatly. And a lot of what we do is, get initially the system locked down and good to go from getting people on it and running. And then we figure out, how do we make it so we can use orgs and teams and things of that nature to craft the right kind of control for that corporation based on, whatever their needs are for privacy and access and things of that nature. Some of these companies are incredibly siloed, where they have contractors or something like that have to be in their own spot and can't have any access to any of the code. And then others are wide, within the GitHub Enterprise install are very open and collaborative. And so we've seen every variation of this under the sun up to this point. So we've gotten some great insights into this. And when we're on site, we do different things like set up your primary instance, set up your high availability instance. We set up backup utils so that it's running for disaster recovery. And then we also go through and do, even Git and GitHub workflow training, as well as, connecting APIs, setting up authentication, all the things of that nature. So we've had some great experience up to this point. So to get started, I took this picture yesterday over on the other side of the building. I thought this looked pretty nice with the sun coming in there at the end of the day. I was noticing all the holes in the side of the building and thought it's really cool that it feels like both inside and outside, and you're letting a little bit of the outside in. That's the opposite of what people usually want to do on GitHub Enterprise. They want to have it completely locked down. Both use cases work very well for what they're doing. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. And so to get started right from the very beginning, I don't know, how many people here are using GitHub Enterprise? Okay, so any .com? How many .com? Okay, yeah, so it's pretty applicable for the session. So many of you may already know this, but when you log into GitHub Enterprise, you're going to launch up the service, you're going to get the VM up and running, and then it's going to ask you to create a password pretty much immediately and enter your license for GitHub. And so the password that you choose in that instance is for access to the entire instance, so SSH commands and different things of that nature. And so it's a very privileged very privileged access that you can get into that with SSH access and everything. You're going to want to set up your password here so that you don't forget it, first of all, or write it in some place where people can find it. We had someone call the other day and say, hey, do I have to totally restart my instance and reset everything up because I forgot the password that I set up in the initial, consultation? And we said, no, you can use, you can SSH in if you've added your SSH key. So that brings me to my next point. Is one of the first steps you're going to do is you're going to add your SSH key to GitHub, and that makes it so administrators can go in, and there's lots of command line utilities that you can run to, to promote an instance to the primary instance if there's some problem with the original primary, to promoting users to site administrators, and various different things of that nature, and also reporting and things. And so you're going to want to set this up, add your SSH key, and that's usually the DevOps team or the infrastructure team or whoever's running GitHub Enterprise and is overseeing the day-to-day maintenance of it and support of it. So once you have that, one of the main decisions you're going to have is, do you make this externally available or not? So is your GitHub Enterprise install available outside of your firewall? And people go back and forth on this, obviously, a great deal, because it has determinations of, do we need to use VPN? And sometimes, depending on geography and different things of that nature, that can slow things down. But this is pretty important. And let me just ask right now, what is the percentage of people who have their enterprise instance publicly available? Just out of curiosity, yeah? Okay, yeah. So and I've seen probably about 50-50 in the field where people, some people will say yes, some people will say no. It just depends on the use case and where people are accessing it from as well. It's really, when you do lock it down with no one outside of your firewall, there's obviously far less risk there than otherwise, but you can often set up things to mitigate that. So if you do set it up so it's publicly available, and this is especially applicable for people who have that publicly available setting, it is required that you set up private mode in the GitHub installation when you're going through the setup screen. So this is one of the options in there, and when you click that, it makes it so none of the Git and GitHub data is available external to people that are not inside of the firewall. So you have to be authenticated, really, to be able to see any of the data when you have private mode on. And if your instance is publicly available outside of your firewall, this is a required setting per your GitHub contract. And so you have to turn this on because we want to be very explicit to say that if you have it open publicly, there could be a developer that doesn't know what they're doing and says, I'm going to open source this project, not realizing that it's not just internally that they're open sourcing it to, they're open sourcing it to the world. So you're going to absolutely want to pay attention to that setting, and if you don't know which one you have right now set up, I would check that when you get back. Another one that you're going to want to check when you go through this is, if you look on the top of the slide, right at the top checkbox where it says subdomain isolation, this is another feature that's really important from a security perspective when you're setting up GitHub Enterprise with your DNS records. So subdomain isolation separates user-supplied content from other portions of the GitHub Enterprise appliance, and this mitigates cross-site scripting and other related vulnerabilities. If you don't have subdomain isolation turned on, it's going to add endpoints for a whole bunch of the different resources that GitHub goes and accesses when it's up and running, and it makes you vulnerable to those. And so if you go in and set up a DNS wildcard for a subdomain, or you explicitly go in and add each subdomain into your DNS records, then you can not have to worry about that problem. And there's a GitHub help article. If you just search GitHub Enterprise subdomain isolation, there's a really good article that shows you each and every individual DNS record that you're going to have to enter in, or what the actual assets will be that it's delivering up. All right, so that brings us to one of the huge parts of securing your GitHub Enterprise appliance, and that's authentication. So most people that use GitHub Enterprise are using their own custom authentication system for their company. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it. You can do Open LDAP, you can do LDAP with Active Directory, you can do SAML, with a provider like Okta or something of that nature. And so I'm going to highlight specifically LDAP as I go through here, but it's applicable for the other protocols as well. Let's see. So just right when you first get started in the setup page and you're setting up authentication, there's a few different options that you're going to want to look at. The administrators group is one, And then another one is the restricted user group. So the administrators group, that one is anyone who belongs to that group, let's say in Active Directory behind the scenes. Anyone who's a part of that group, when they access GitHub and log in, they will automatically be promoted to the site administrator, which is the equivalent of that password that you set up at the initial part of the GitHub Enterprise installation. And they will be, in essence, omnipotent inside of your GitHub Enterprise instance. So this should be a very small group of people that have access to this. They'll be able to impersonate a user for troubleshooting and things of that nature with, logging a reason why they're doing it as well. But they will have access to the entire GitHub Enterprise instance once they're in there. It's a really convenient way, if you have like a group for emails or something like that, to just tie that to this as well for the support team if the plan is to have all of them accessing this. And that way, there's people who can always troubleshoot and things of that nature and have access to everything. The other one down there is a restricted user group. So there's a few different use cases for the restricted user group. One is it does a really great job of making it explicit as to who can access GitHub Enterprise from an access perspective. So anyone who you add inside of that group will be able to log into GitHub. If you don't have something like that set up, then anyone who can authenticate with your authentication provider can log into GitHub Enterprise. And so we set up that group often, call it GitHub-users or something of that nature, so that it's a very deliberate step to say we are giving them access into these controls. And another nice thing about this too is that's actually a phenomenal way, as most of you I assume are administrators. This is also a great way to restrict seat count as well. So you can just have that one LDAP group that's the restricted group, and then you don't have people logging in and taking up seats that you don't want to have them take up. So that's a common use case. And as well, when let's say you have the event of someone leaving the company or something of that nature, if you have that restricted user group set up, there's only one spot to really remove them, and they lose all access to GitHub Enterprise. And so that's for workflows and for administrating the enterprise device, that's a really nice setting to be able to have that one spot. So LDAP provides sync, which is a really nice feature. It's the only protocol that we currently have right now that provides syncing. And so whatever you have in your groups, like let's say an Active Directory, that'll carry over into the teams and things of that nature in GitHub Enterprise. And so you can map different fields to go over there, but when you turn on that synchronization, you can also map SSH keys and emails so that you have those defined and inside of the instance. So that's nice as well, because then you can control through fields, in Active Directory, who can access or the SSH key for that user, and it makes it a pretty nice workflow as well for the user when they're being managed in that regard through automated tools or things of that nature. All right, so there's also ways to remove SSH keys as an administrator. So I don't know who's heard in 2.3 we released a bunch more enterprise administration endpoints in the API. And one of them that was nice was the ability to go in and retrieve all of the different SSH keys that are on the appliance, and the ability to be able to revoke those SSH keys through the API as well. And so that gives you a lot of flexibility to be able to do audits on those and to be able to go through it periodically if you desire and remove the ones that should be removed based on whatever parameters you set up and can access. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about documentation and onboarding for security for GitHub Enterprise. So I think this is often a missed opportunity that people overlook when they're setting up GitHub and approaching it from a security perspective. So documentation and onboarding is a way to train your users on how to use the enterprise appliance so that it's the most secure as possible, and so that you're obeying all the auditing and different protocols of that nature. Who here writes code on like a day-to-day basis while they're also administrating? So the vast majority of you, GitHub Enterprise. So we all know README files, and I don't know how many people know of the contributing.md file that's especially popular in open source projects, but it's supported on GitHub Enterprise as well. And you can, for private repositories and things like that. With a contributing.md file and the README file, you can actually say, when a new user comes on board, instead of them getting to the point where they're going to deploy, and they sit down with a couple people a couple times, they show them it, and then they're like, all right, you're good to go, you're a smart person, right? And they're nodding their head. Instead of, to avoid situations of that nature, I think it's a really great pattern to set up in the README, how you get up and running with your project that you're going to be accessing. And then in the contributing.md file, that'll show up, let me just show you this right here. That'll show up in a pull request. And so you can see right here, underneath the pull request, as soon as someone goes to open one up, it's going to prompt them and say, please review the guidelines for contributing to this repository. And so I highly recommend, if you have that contributing.md file on the top level of the repository, it'll pull up in here just through GitHub's styling, and it'll pull up that file. They can click on it right there and then go view it. And the best practices that we've seen and help people launch is when we go places, we actually go through and set up a step-by-step flow for developers to say, you go through each one of these steps when you're going to contribute code, and make sure that you're matching it up with the following step in the contributing.md file. And that's the path that we go through to launch any code. So it's a great way to make sure that specific protocols are happening, especially if there's audits or things of that nature. It's really great to be able to have them walk through that pattern and know that it's very well documented as to how they go about doing those steps. So let me start with saying orgs and teams. So this is huge in GitHub Enterprise, as it's the main way that you're going to restrict access within the GitHub Enterprise appliance. We've actually revamped orgs and teams recently. I don't know if people have seen that recent blog post, but they got a pretty big rewrite to make it a little more granular and easier to use. The primary purpose of orgs and teams is first and foremost for access. Like for org specifically, the org on GitHub Enterprise is pretty much it's a very close to exact use case of an org on GitHub or GitHub.com. Where we have two very diverse companies like Twitter Bootstrap, let's say, and a large corporation that are both using GitHub.com, and we need to silo that information and separate it from each other. That is the same use case for an org on GitHub Enterprise. And so if you want intercommunication between these different organizations, it doesn't permit that as in the old version or in the new version, because they want those to be siloed. But it does let you restrict access based on those things, which is very helpful. And it's really going to be the granular control that you use to restrict who can access certain repositories and what permissions they have in those repositories. So for GitHub Teams, there is a new GitHub team flow that's quite nice, where if you remember, right now, the current dynamic with GitHub Teams is that if you had, let's say, a QA team, and you wanted your QA team to be able to have write access to certain repositories, like let's say repositories they own, but then read access to other repositories that they shouldn't be manipulating or anything of that nature. It was a very common pattern to set up two of the teams of the same name with just adding the permissions right into the team name. So I've seen a lot of people do like QA-read and QA-write, and then they would give permissions based on that to the different teams in GitHub Enterprise. The new permissions model does not necessitate that anymore. So if you can see in this, on the right here, you'll have on the left side in the old model, it would have this team is secret and it's only visible to members and owners. That's what it currently says. The old one would say that it would have your write or read or admin privileges right there on the side. So the privilege would be based on the whole entire team, not on a specific repository. And now you can actually have secret teams so that they're not visible to people who are not administrators of the organization. And you can have granular control of the repositories over on the right side. So if you see, this has GitHub School example-foundations, that has write access. There's also read and admin. And so you can set it up specifically so each team, so it more closely represents your organizational structure inside of your company. Each team can have its own separate access for an individual repository, and then you can just have one that people mention, when they need review of a pull request or something of that nature, they don't have to filter through these different team names that will have different permissions baked into the team. So this is a much simpler way to examine this now and to give access to people that need it and to fine-tune what access they can have. All right, and then, well, actually, let me share one more thing about this, the team. So I don't know how many people use GitHub Enterprise to specifically collaborate, you know, with other teams and things of that nature through @mentions in GitHub. You know, let me just see your hands if you do that. Yeah. So that's a highly underutilized feature of GitHub, where if in internal GitHub, if we have a feature that someone's writing and it's going to hit two-factor authentication or the new YubiKey, you know, authentication or something of that like that, inside of the pull request, we have a team. You know, we have, I think, you know, in the 300 range for employees, and we have about 500 teams in GitHub in our GitHub installation. And so our teams far outnumber our individual employees in the company, and we use this for communication of all types. You know, for you know, kickball teams. You know, we have a team up and running. You know, to mention people and HR. You know, and you know, ordering new equipment. We have repos for all of these as well. So our use of it is probably an extreme example, but the really nice thing for security is that when you have teams set up for collaboration, you'll notice that your software becomes much more secure, because when someone's writing a feature, instead of just pushing it and then, you know, one person on their team says, thumbs up, this looks good to merge in, and they merge it in, once you have these teams set up for specific functionalities of the site, you know, like we have a repositories team and in different things of that nature, if anything is going to touch the code and we think it can impact those teams at all, we'll mention those teams in pull requests and say, can you come get your eyes on this and review this? And that makes a big difference for not necessarily the security of your GitHub Enterprise install, but also the security of whatever it is that you're actually working on and the software that you're delivering. So I would highly recommend using Teams to have a security team, you know, to have, if let's say you decided to go and implement, you know, the YubiKeys, to have a team specific for that so people can mention them, bring them into conversations, and you'll notice that the level of security will just increase incrementally as time goes on based on the increased communication. Okay, so I don't know if people have seen this recently, but we recently launched protected branches and required status checks. So protected branches and required status checks, I don't know if any of you know, that has been a very commonly requested feature in the lifetime of GitHub. And so we just were really excited to launch it. We launched it, you know, and just kind of letting people know about the feature in September, and it's been well received so far for the people that I've talked to that have used it. So what this does is this gives you the ability to go in, and especially from an auditing perspective for company security, it lets you go in and to define a default branch, and then to choose a protected branch and edit that protected branch and make sure that it passes CI, for instance, make sure you can use, I don't know who was here for Kyle's presentation right before the API, but you know, you can use the API and things like that to run just whatever check you'd like on the code that the API, you know, brings you back the information for. And then you can disable like the merge button, for instance, and have required statuses before people can merge code. So this is a phenomenal way to just, you know, we just open it up to you to take this very simple feature and then design it however you'd like to set up your organizational security for who can merge in code and deploy and things of that nature. All right, and then one thing that I wanted to chat as well about that I've seen a lack of familiarity with when I visited people on site is the audit logs. So inside of GitHub Enterprise, if you click on the contextual rocket ship icon in the top right of the screen, that's the site administration button. The first time you click on that, just so everyone knows, it'll bring you to the admin for whatever it is that you're viewing. So if you're viewing a repository, it'll bring you to the admin section of that repository, or an org or a user. If you click on it again, it brings you to this overall site admin with this side nav that has the management console, which there's tons of monitoring and things of that nature in there. And then license info, all these different things that you can look through and administer. And also users, you can suspend users from that and you can make sure dormant users aren't taking up seat licenses if that's a problem. But the auditing log I wanted to bring special attention to, because this is a really powerful way to keep track of whatever's happening inside of your instance. There's also a way in GitHub Enterprise where you can see, it depends on how your firewall's set up, but you can see the IP addresses of any requests that are coming inbound into it, and it'll map it out on a map in another different part of the interface. So with the audit log, you can go through and you can see the syntax there. It'll have like a repo.create and that top list item. It'll have user.log in there underneath. This is just a little instance that I set up just to demo this. And you can see the action that people are taking and the IP address that they're doing it from. And there's also events in the API where you can subscribe to specific events. And you can see what's happening, and you can make tools, you can script tools that will take action based on what's happening, and the different events that are being kicked off. So that's a really useful tool there to be able to just go through and say, we're going to have complete oversight of what's happening in this instance, and we're going to be tracking what users do, and it also gives you the ability to help them, not just to audit them or different things of that nature if you see someone's having a problem. But so that's the main things that I had today. I wanted to have about 10 minutes left just so people can move up to the front if they want, or you can just holler out and ask questions. But that's the main topics that I wanted to hit for the general main points of securing your GitHub Enterprise instance. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah, go ahead. I'll repeat the question just for people in the back, yeah. I see, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, there's the contributing MD file, but that's on a per repository basis. Is there a way to do that across the whole entire instance? And so what we commonly do when we go on site with people is right before we leave, we'll actually go through and create a repository, an onboarding repository for all the team members who are going to start getting onboarded into GitHub Enterprise. And we'll actually go through and pretty much outline, like this is how we're using the GitHub Enterprise instance. They may do it, we just use a repository because that's how we default to things. You can do it in things like Confluence or different tools of that nature. You can document the process. And so we'll have a repository called like onboarding, that'll just be generic based on, best practices for the organization, security protocols, maybe specific teams to reach out to if they have any questions or if they need to get special approval for different things. I know, like, for instance, some people will require the individual employees to come to the enterprise admin individuals to create repositories for the org or things of that nature. And so we document inside of a repo or whatever tool they have the steps that they can take to, for really any part of using the GitHub Enterprise instance. And then we also go into the contributing.md file for specific, for per repo instructions. You can also, inside of there, you could write a script pretty easily to go and add that file to every single repo. And then just in the top of, the first item for that contributing.md file, reference wherever the documentation lives, general instance altogether. And so we do it through just, training mostly, but there isn't a current way to push it, to all repositories based on the UI or anything like that. But it's an interesting feature. So, any other questions? Yeah, in the back. If you want to exclude certain users based on a repo, is that right? On a Puppet repo, is that what you said? Oh, a public repo, okay. So there's different ways that you can do that. You can make it so people are required to do forks, whenever they want to access a repository. So they'd have to fork a repo and then contribute through that, or they can be added to the specific collaborator section of a repository in the settings. There's not a current way to go through and say, like, these are the blessed people who can merge, or anything like that through the UI. But you could do something like you could use I haven't seen anyone do this yet, but you could use the CI tool and the required statuses to go through and say, verify that these certain individuals have commented on the repo and put, some text, a thumbs up or something, or a ship it squirrel, and don't turn on the merge button until that exists in there. So there's different ways to do it, but there's no way to currently do that through the UI. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. How does the directory mapping map to the seat count? So it's really just anyone who's logged in to the enterprise instance is taking up a seat. If you go into the admin section on the side, there is the all users portion and then the dormant users. So you can see in the dormant users, it'll tell you based on what metric they're going to be considered dormant or not. It's like it's a month of inactivity for certain functionalities that they can perform. And then there's a suspend button. It depends on how you're doing it. Like if you're doing it with LDAP sync, you would remove them from the LDAP, the Active Directory group or whatever you're using. And then but you can also just go through the UI with other authentication methods and just suspend them there. But it's anyone who's logged in who has not explicitly been suspended is going to use the seat. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I think I'm pretty positive that when you turn that on, it's going to redirect everything that needs to be redirected and take care of any of those different considerations. So I think good point. So he was saying if he has a large GitHub Enterprise install and it's been used for a considerable amount of time and he's going to turn on subdomain isolation now, how will that impact users and all the things that they've already set up? And it will take care of that. It'll migrate everything over, and you should be totally fine to do that. So, yeah. Yes. Yep. Yeah, go ahead. Did you say, is it possible to force users to use multi-factor authentication? So it's not currently, so there's a few different ways that you can do this, but there's not a checkbox, let's say, on the setup page level that says everyone in this instance have two-factor auth on. There is the possibility, there is reporting, in APIs that will report who has it turned on. And I know that the Guardian has an open source project that'll actually run. And if someone doesn't have it turned on, it'll give them a warning, and then it will suspend their account through the API. So I think that one's called GU-who is the GitHub branch, if I remember correctly. But it's the Guardian release that. That's a pretty commonly used tool, but there is currently no way to enforce it like on an org level or anything like that. There's lots of, can you hear me now? Okay, yeah. There's lots of ways that you can get that auditing report of who does have it turned on, but there's no like heavy-handed setting that says you just cannot access the instance yet if it's not turned on, yeah. Anything else? All right, well, we have a few minutes left, so if anyone wants to come up and ask any questions, I'll be up here for a few more minutes as well, but thanks for coming, and I appreciate it. Yeah.